Welcome back to another edition of Literary Diss Tracks. Today we have J.R.R. Tolkien, author of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and Frank Herbert, author of the Dune saga. Now this is a super interesting one, insofar as we have the figurehead of modern fantasy versus one of the figureheads of modern science fiction. However, in terms of what was actually said, this literary diss track is actually pretty tame compared to some of the others that we've looked at. But beneath the surface, it's pretty complex and raises a very relevant philosophical question of one's moral and ethical approach to the chaos and terror of modern existence, one that I'll be posing at the end of this video, so stick around. In March of 1966, just 1 year after the publication of Dune, a fan sends to Tolkien a copy of Dune, and Tolkien responds with his thoughts on the book, writing, quote, "It is impossible for an author still writing to be fair to another author working along the same lines. At least I find it so. In fact, I dislike Dune with some intensity, and in that unfortunate case, it is much the best and fairest to another author to keep silent and refuse to comment." But anyways, that's all we have of Tolkien's thoughts on Dune, which of course leaves a ton of room for interpretation, as there's a dearth of scholarship on this topic, although there's plenty of theories emerging from fans of either writer or both writers. And I'll be looking at some of these fan theories and then offering a sort of grand interpretation of my own, a theory that comes down to literary periodization, namely that Tolkien emerges from, if not a part of, modernism, whereas Frank Herbert more closely aligns to postmodernism. You can watch my previous video on the differences between modernism and postmodernism if you like, though I'll be providing sort of a small refresher as we go. But first, what are the fans saying? Most of these fan theories regarding Tolkien's distaste for Dune center around Tolkien's devoted interest in Catholicism, which is reflected in his work as it's constantly emphasizing the individual's duty to pursue intrinsically good acts for the sake of goodness itself. Now, this brand of ethics comes to us by way of philosopher Immanuel Kant and is called deontological ethics. Within this school of ethical thought, there are intrinsically good actions and intrinsically bad actions, and no matter the consequences, one ought to pursue goodness itself because it is impossible for a person to divine the full extent of the consequences of one's actions.
There's some good in this world, Mr. Frodo.
As this further applies to Lord of the Rings, the ring itself becomes kind of a barometer of one's own ethics, as characters like Boromir, for instance, wrestle with their desire for its power, a power that, at least in their mind, may produce some good consequence in the long run. But the good act itself is to destroy the ring without trying to predict the consequences of acting outside of that act. Or as Gandalf, Tolkien's kind of avatar throughout the books, puts it, quote, "Many that live deserve death. Some that die deserve life. Can you give it to them, Frodo? Do not be too eager to deal out death in judgment. Even the very wise cannot see all ends." In contrast, Frank Herbert holds a much more cynical view of religion and deontological ethics, which you can see playing out through the religious order of the Bene Gesserit, which manipulates the masses by appealing to their maybe hunger for good versus bad. And this is further compounded by their manipulative rhetoric of the Messiah that Paul Atreides ultimately adopts for himself.
I'm pointing the way!
Reflecting this cynicism, the Dune saga adheres more to an ethics of consequentialism, or a moral philosophy in which the ends largely justify the means, and acts in and of themselves really have no moral value when detached from the consequences they produce. Therefore, the question of moral or ethical action is a question of the outcome that comes from the action itself. And then there are some theories that Tolkien envied the younger writer's success, which seems to me the least likely of them all. It's just hard for me to imagine Tolkien being too daunted by Dune's success. But all of these differences between Tolkien and Herbert, whether religious, moral, philosophical, or even aesthetic, I think can be accounted for when we consider the literary and philosophical context of their respective times, a contrast that comes down to literary modernism versus literary postmodernism. It should be said, scholars are largely divided on the question of whether or not Tolkien was a modernist. Certainly, he was active during England's modernist period in that first half of the 20th century, but that doesn't automatically make him a modernist per se. Scholars who would argue that Tolkien is not a modernist would point to the fact that defining features of literary modernism, things like fragmentation, stream of consciousness, and an insistence on newness and invention, are largely lacking from the Lord of the Rings trilogy, which in my mind also kind of reflects a broader tendency to group genre fiction apart from the literary canon. However, Others would argue that not only does Lord of the Rings exhibit a drastically new style of writing, but it's incredibly avant-garde, intertextual, and linguistically oriented, three sort of pillars of literary modernism. Consider, for instance, how Tolkien intertextually weaves into the narrative compendiums, languages, maps, and these sort of metatextual histories. But the question of whether or not Tolkien was a modernist seems to me far less important than the fact that he, like every modernist writer of his time, was writing in response to their rapidly changing world. And this was a changing world that in their eyes was truly terrifying. For instance, Tolkien himself fought in World War I, a world event that highlighted to him and many, many others the frailty of existence, inducing this kind of crushing sense of existentialism. And while most modernists examine this existentialism as a potentially freeing philosophy, one that allows the individual to then define for themselves new transcendent truths, Tolkien went in the opposite direction entirely, creating a sort of alternate world through Middle Earth in which a singular truth could be seen to overcome evil. A world in which there seems to be no hope of salvation, and yet good people doing good things brings it about by adhering to a strict ethics of goodness. Frank Herbert, on the other hand, was born 28 years after Tolkien, born in America. He began researching Dune in 1959, and it would be published in 65. This lines him up with the early stages of literary postmodernism, but we'll return to that in just a moment. As someone with a vested interest in environmentalism and libertarianism, Herbert was very critical of America's involvement in foreign wars, especially Vietnam, and I would also argue that the Dune saga is similarly very critical of the nuclear arms race between America and the Soviet Union. So we encounter an immediate similarity between both Tolkien and Herbert. Namely, both writers were writing in response to chaotic and even existentialist times. However, the crucial difference is their philosophical approach to their respective times. Whereas it could be argued that Tolkien's approach to the chaos of modernism was to envision an alternate world that suffers chaos but is saved by individually inspired collective goodness, Herbert's approach is regarded to be much more cynical. In the Dune saga, goodness for goodness' sake, or that sort of deontological ethics, is almost nowhere to be seen, as it would represent a political naivete amongst the great houses of the novels. Instead, what we see is a focus on consequentialism, or that question of which acts, no matter their intrinsic goodness or badness, produce the greatest results. However, in Dune, what's highlighted is that the people making these decisions are not making them for the greatest number of people, but rather for themselves. For this reason, I'd hesitate to say that Herbert is really even advertising consequentialism, but rather perhaps criticizing it and even warning people of any political power's claim to ethical principle. For this reason, I'd argue that Herbert's writing is a reflection of the shift from modernism to postmodernism, because while the modernists responded to the rapidly altering and sometimes terrifying world by reinscribing notions of truth and faith in truth, the postmodernists largely abandoned what's perceived to be this futile search, and in its place is a pervasive nihilism and cynicism. However, this doesn't mean that the postmodernists simply abandoned caring about the world. Their nihilism and cynicism is often in service of critiquing certain power structures. And you can see this in the work of other postmodernist science fiction writers like Kurt Vonnegut or Octavia Butler. So, in returning to Tolkien's muted critique of Herbert, I would argue that Tolkien saw Herbert's cynicism and the total lack of goodness in those novels as a nihilistic stance that indicated at best a kind of moral neutrality that would only further reproduce the evils of a fallen world, whereas someone like Herbert, although we don't have his thoughts on the matter, may have seen Tolkien's approach as idealistic and maybe politically backwards, insofar as goodness for goodness' sake fails to take into consideration the gradients of complexity that come with interrogating and perhaps dismantling manipulative power structures. So we're left with the question of immediate relevance. How should we approach ethics and action in our own time? One that I think we can all agree is a time of enormous uncertainty, panic, and chaos. Do we hold to an ideal of doing good in hopes that we produce in the world a greater goodness? Or do we turn our attention instead to fighting manipulative and suppressive articulations of power by any means necessary? Let me know what you think in the comments, and as always, who do you got in this one, Frank Herbert or J.R.R. Tolkien?